Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is journalist Stephen Starr, who is currently in Tipperary, Ireland. He is Irish, and he has worked as a freelancer for the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and other publications from Syria, from Damascus specifically, where he lived for about 5 years. Stephen, thank you for joining us on CivilNet.
Thank you for having me.
That's correct, right? You lived in Syria for about 5 years?
Yeah, almost 5 years. I spent kind of the last 18 months in the entire duration of the revolution in a town outside Damascus, about 15 kilometers southwest of the capital. So, I had a different kind of view of things than what people living in the city had, because the city was essentially a bubble and continues to be something, resembling a bubble in terms of how people think of what's happening, who they think is responsible, and, what they think should be done to fix what is essentially a crisis. This is what people in Syria refer to it as a crisis.
You've just published a book. It's called Revolt in Syria. And you were clearly there at the beginning of the revolt. When did you leave?
I left in the middle of mid-February of this year, 2012.
That's kind of a bad time for a journalist to leave. Why did you leave?
I left because I'd visited some areas and kind of seen some things and reported on some things that could possibly get me into a lot of trouble with the authorities. Up until that time, I had been very careful about what I was doing in my correspondence with newspapers and with people, with activists and so on, that I needed to speak to for my work, obviously. And opportunity came up in February to go and visit an area close to Damascus, which had seen huge demonstrations, a place in eastern Damascus. It had seen huge demonstrations, but we had heard reports that the regime had taken back the area. So I was with the foreign editor of the London Times newspaper, and he asked if I wanted to come along. They were going out to this area to look for an underground hospital, and he asked, and I essentially I couldn't say no, because I felt being there, I wasn't getting to see a lot of what was happening, because I was there as a long-term resident, as a journalist, and so on. Many of the journalists that came to Syria were there for a week or maybe 10 days, and then they flew back to the countries they came from. There was no kind of long-term security risk to them. But yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the fact that I lived there, it was a very different situation, because they knew where I lived. They knew who my friends were. They knew they had my phone number and contact details. And
Who is they? Who is they?
They means the government. They means anybody from kind of the Ministry for Information, who give out the journalist visas. Anyone from those people to the security, to the army, to the local police. It could be anyone, but essentially people related at least to the government and the regime.
When we talk about Syria, sometimes some people think that it's really quite a direct path, and that were the regime to fall, when the regime does fall, that things somehow will, fall into place. Do you think it's that simple?
I think the longer the regime stays in place and the longer the regime continues to do what it's doing, which is shelling residential areas, killing lots of people, and there have been obviously a certain number of atrocious massacres taking place too. The longer those things continue, the more difficult it would be to put the country back together after the regime falls. I think it's inevitable that the regime is going to fall. It's not possible. You cannot subjugate millions of people continuously. That time has passed. It's not possible. People have lost the fear, that kind of accompanied their lives for decades. I mean, when if someone in Syria has lost a father or son or some relative, they've lost the fear with that. I mean, they don't care about what happens to them anymore, and they will pick up guns and they will fight the regime. So I mean, to get back to answering your question, the longer the regime stays in power, the more difficult it's going to be. I think if the regime had left, but in either way, kind of violently or otherwise, maybe 12 months ago, the country had a very good chance of being stable in the short and medium term, and maybe continuing to operate as a functioning state. At the moment now, it's going to be much more difficult.
If and when the regime were to fall, is the next likely step continued civil war, or is the next likely step fragmentation?
I mean, I would hope to think that it's neither. I would hope to think that the numbers of people who would like to continue a civil war. Now, I guess I'm talking about the Alawi population of the country. They're very small. They're about 10 to 12% of the overall population, and they are not majority populations in any major cities or towns anywhere in the country.
So they're not a viable unit anywhere.
I think not. You know, aside from the villages in the mountains along the Mediterranean coast, they are, you know, there are lots of kind of villages there that are predominantly Alawi. But nowhere in the major cities, even on the coast, do you have majority population of Alawis, which is, you know, which could be areas where they could, you know, barricade their own kind of neighborhoods and kind of launch something, I guess, resembling a civil war.
What about a coalition of Alawis and other minorities?
I don't think so. I don't think Christians are going to pick up guns for. I mean, essentially, they're fighting for this idea of Bashar al-Assad and what he stands for. Once Bashar al-Assad,
who is fighting for that?
the Alawi people. Now, if we're talking about a continued civil war happening, this was what it would be. It would be Alawis who were afraid, and they would be continuing to fight for this idea of what Bashar stood for. Once he's gone, I think there's very little for them to fight for. And I don't think Christians, and I don't think other Druze, and I don't think other minority populations would fight. I don't think they would pick up a gun for something they don't necessarily believe in. That's something they don't kind of have a direct link with.
So if civil war is not necessarily a guaranteed outcome of the fall of the regime, and if each of the minorities are not solid and sizable and viable enough to sustain fragmentation, then what is a likely outcome?
You know, it's very difficult to say. I mean, if you could tell me that the regime was going to fall in 2 months' time, then I would be able to say, you know, A would probably happen or B would probably happen or so on. But we don't know how long the regime is able to hold out for, and they have surprised more than myself in their durability, in their ability to continue fighting the rebels and so on. You know, I think what's happening in Aleppo works as a kind of a microcosm for the greater situation. That you have this kind of it's a conflict that's playing out on the ground where neither side is strong enough to defeat the other, and the other side isn't weak enough to be beaten. In long term, this could be, you know, across the country, not just in Aleppo. This could be a scene that plays out in Damascus and in other parts of the country too.
Explain, please, since you were there at the beginning of the revolt. You know, all of us who watch countries like Syria, have, you know, connections there, know very well that for decades, various minorities have lived alongside each other, sometimes companionably, sometimes not so much. And some of them have seen loss, some of them have seen subjugation. What changed so that the people, in fact, lost that fear that you mentioned and actually decided to take up arms in such a broad way, not amongst the specific communities that were specifically wronged, not just in the neighborhoods where children had been attacked, but so broadly? What broke that camel's back?
Well, I think it's very, very simple and very clear. The regime caused what we have now. They caused this civil war, and the regime is the creator of the Free Syrian Army. When you react to people peacefully walking in the street who were calling for reform and calling for change and calling for dignity and respect, which is what happened in Daraa back in March 2011. When you react to this gathering of people in the street with guns and with shooting people, you know, point blank, basically, there's only going to be one reaction to that. You know, people will not accept to be shot dead in the street for calling for reform and for calling for some dignity. And you know, it instantly radicalized a growing population. I mean, we have to remember too that if one person gets detained or tortured or is shot dead by the army, overnight you have a huge network of people who are instantly anti-regime, you know, in terms of friends and family and so on.
One last question. You were there before the revolt started, for years before the revolt started. If someone had asked you 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that, what do you think? What's going to happen? Would you have said there's a revolt coming?
I think when you have a population of people that live in not a state of fear, but they're held back from talking about certain things, and they're held back from expressing their opinions and their feelings and sentiments on certain issues. When you have that state, it's inevitable that at some time, somewhere along the way, someone is going to stand up and say, "I want to say what I want to say. I don't want to be afraid anymore, and I want to be able to gather freely in the street and speak my mind in the street and not be afraid of what's going to happen to me." So I think when you have people, I don't want to say repressed, but when you have this fear in the society of talking about certain issues, and politics and security were certainly an issue. When you have this fear, it's unsustainable that this will go on. That people will continue not to talk about certain important aspects of their life. For the most part, people they want to be respected by the state. They see the government as being run by a family, and there are 23 million people in Syria, and they all have a right to kind of discovering their own future and to playing out what's going to happen to them as time goes on. And they don't see it as with the government that's in power at the moment. They don't see that happening at all. They see it as being run by this mafia family, which is self-interested and brutal and so on. Now, again, I need to qualify what I'm saying too, because if you speak to Christians, they will say, that the Assad family is the protector of all Christians in Syria, and you say the same. Alois will say the same, and many Druze people will say the same also. So we have to be very careful. It's as your quote. I mean, it's a very very complicated region, and Syria is perhaps one of the most complicated countries in the Middle East.
Well, on that explanatory note, and I especially appreciate the word that you used, unsustainable, that, situations of human rights, civil rights, when there is that much disrespect and intolerance, unsustainable, I suppose is the right word, witness Syria. We've been speaking with journalist Stephen Starr, who is from Ireland but has lived in Syria for about 5 years and is the author of the recent book, Revolt in Syria. Stephen, thank you for speaking with CivilNet.
Thank you.